In today's episode of the Iman Wire podcast.
The story of the mother of Moses and the way Allah works her heart in just this beautiful way, kind of like holds it together when she's falling apart with heartache and heartbreak. And there's this reciprocal relationship between the trust that the mother of Moses has in that moment for this instinct, this revelatory instinct that she has, and then the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds to her faithfulness. And I'd like to think that, even if we're not the mother of a prophet, that there's something in that moment that speaks deeply to us just in our ordinary lives.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Iman Wire podcast. Celene here. Joining me today is Dr. Celene Ibrahim, who is the author of Women and Gender in the Qur'an. Dr. Ibrahim holds a PhD in Arabic and Islamic Civilizations from Brandeis University, a Master's of Divinity from Harvard University, and a bachelor's degree with highest honors from Princeton University. Dr. Ibrahim, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the podcast.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on the show.
Alhamdulillah, we're glad to have you on. Now, you have written this book, which, I'll give you the opportunity to introduce in a moment. For our listeners who may not be yet familiar with the book, can you give us a little background about the aims of this book?
So as your listeners might be aware, Quranic studies in the academy, as the ways that the scholars coming out of a mainly Eurocentric heritage have studied the Qur'an, are in some ways different than the ways that our traditional ulama and those who specialize in Quranic studies, specifically in we could say ulum al-Qur'an. There's a difference of approach, and at the core of that, the difference of approach is how we understand the provenance of the text. Does this book, does this revelation, does this recitation, does it come from a divine source? And of course, the ulama have their perspective on that. And then the secular academy, by virtue of the nature of the way knowledge is constructed, in order to write in a secular academy, one has to write from the position of examining sort of the Qur'an from literary perspectives or from historical perspectives or philological perspectives, looking at the meaning of words and how that meaning changes over time from pre-Islamic Arabia to the present, for instance. And I think the art of what I was trying to do with this particular book is make an intervention in both the field of ulum al-Qur'an as we take it as Muslims and the field of Quranic studies as it is developing in the more Eurocentric academic paradigm. And in order to be able to speak to these two audiences, one, this Muslim audience who looks to the Qur'an as a source of wisdom and guidance, and to this academic audience who is interested in philology and history and the ways in which the Qur'an is received over time, I have to develop somewhat unique methods. And this requires that I, for instance, in the book, speak about the Qur'an kind of in a contained, comprehensive way as a text, as the academics are commonly speaking about an artifact of history in one lens. And at the same time, I'm writing in a way that is drawing on my theological training, and I'm trying to pull out of stories messages that would be relevant for people who are engaging with the Qur'an in contemporary times. And so you could say I'm trying to wear like a multicolored hijab or something, one that speaks to this devotional audience and kind of one that speaks to this academic audience. And so I think that one of the ways in which I make a contribution to, we could say, the tradition, the Islamic tradition, is that before I was writing, there wasn't a book that comprehensively looks at every single verse in the Qur'an that deals with a female figure. And I isolated female figures because there's so many verses in the Qur'an that deal with gender broadly. Gender we can think of as the social construction, the rules and regulations, the ways in which male and femaleness is performed in the social world. There's so many verses that relate to the idea of males and females. There's so many verses that could go under the theme of gender broadly in the Qur'an. So I wanted to hone in on female figures because I was very interested in storytelling and the power of storytelling as a didactic strategy, meaning we can learn from reading the stories as ordinary people who engage with the Qur'an. And I also wanted to write the book. This is a bit of a long answer, but I think your audience can appreciate. I wanted to write a book that simultaneously offered something to people who are very, very literate and very fluent with the Qur'an, as well as something that people who are newer to the Qur'anic ethos could enter into and also gain something. So that was the challenge that I set out for myself in terms of speaking to multiple audiences with one work.
Yeah, certainly in the scope of your book, it's very, enlightening to see an analysis of many of the different female figures in the Qur'an. As you point out, in the women in the Qur'an, in the Quranic narratives, they're not passive characters in the story, if you will. They have roles and actions throughout these narratives, which tell us a lot about spiritual truths and the aims of the Quranic message. And as you mentioned, there's a tremendous diversity in the female figures that we see in the Qur'an, and certainly, we can't go through many of the figures in a short discussion here, but we were going to talk about the narrative in the Qur'an related to Prophet Musa or Moses. And, as one of the commentators once said about this, that he said that the Qur'an almost became the story of Musa because there's so much detail about the story of Musa in the Qur'an. And I guess we could add to that the story of Musa in the Qur'an is almost the story of the women in his life. His mother, his sister, his wife, the sisters of Madyan, Asiya, the wife of the Pharaoh. And so there's all of these rich stories that, we can draw lessons from. I was hoping then if we could start then first in this narrative, obviously the story of Musa begins with the story of his mother. So if you could speak about, her narrative in the Qur'an and draw out some lessons for us to reflect on.
SubhanAllah, when Allah narrates this story in the Qur'an for us, starts the story not with the hero who brings about the great revelation, but starts the story with the woman who raised the prophet. And in the case of the mother of Moses, we see that she receives the wahi, this personal revelation to her heart in terms of what to do when her child's life is being threatened by the genocidal forces of the Pharaoh's court. And so I think here it's a story that can strengthen us even in the present moment as people around the world sadly face similar circumstances. So these stories, as I experienced them maybe in my younger years, were things I didn't think actually still happened. And as I grew of consciousness, I realized that these are the stories that we have are actually a reflection of human experience. And in this way, they give us truths about our dispositions should we be in those circumstances. But one of the things that I like to do with the Qur'an is to say, even if we're not in the exact circumstances of the mother of Moses, who is trying to keep her child alive against these imperial soldiers, are there other ways and times in our life where we feel maybe trapped or cornered or just pushed up against a wall? And the story of the mother of Moses and the way Allah works her heart in just this beautiful way, kind of like holds it together when she's falling apart with heartache and heartbreak, and the way that there's this reciprocal relationship between the trust that the mother of Moses has in that moment for this. We can even call it like this this instinct, this revelatory instinct that she has. And then the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds to her faithfulness. And I'd like to think that, even if we're not the mother of a prophet, that there's something in that moment that speaks deeply to us just in our ordinary lives.
One of the things that I found very illuminating about the description you give about the mother of Musa was, as you were mentioning, she received this divine inspiration, obviously faced with the possible loss of her son. As a background, as you mentioned in Surah Al-Qasas, in the beginning of the surah, it speaks about a sort of an overview of the situation of this background of this genocidal Pharaonic regime, and sort of the stakes, the difficulty at that time. But as the Quranic narrative describes, the relief is going to come through, as we learn in the story, it's going to come first from the mother of Moses by following the divine command. And one of the things I thought was very helpful was your analogy of sorts with the mother of Musa with Prophet Ibrahim, who was also confronted with the possible loss of his son. If you could expand about that.
One of the things I do in the book is what we would call in the academy like the structural analysis, where I take themes and tropes in various stories and juxtapose them. And one of the reasons that I do that is because these fascinating parallels come up in certain stories. Like if we think Eid is right around the corner, subhanAllah, and that that is a story that many Muslims would go to right away when we think about the sacrifice that a parent would be willing to make, like the ultimate sacrifice. And then there's also this somewhat parallel story where we have this devout figure also hearing the command, and Ibrahim alayhi salam, in his case, it was kind of through this ru'ya, through this kind of dream vision, and we see that there's actually this beautiful way the Qur'an narrates this story that we don't find in the Genesis stories, that where Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam actually speaks to his son about this vision. And so we also see the son submitting to the vision as well, which is a detail the Qur'an offers that is not in other sources that also narrate this story. But in the case of Musa alayhi salam as a baby, he doesn't obviously also kind of submit to the divine command in that moment. But what we do find is this lovely concept of kind of he's being cast into the river, and then the eye of his sister is cast upon him, and then the mahabba from Allah is cast upon him. And so he is the kind of the recipient of all of these bounties and blessings, and this familial kind of protection and love, and the protection and love of the divine. And we can kind of see a similar way in which the submission of of Ibrahim's son, and I'm specifically saying it, using the ambiguity that is embedded in the Qur'an. The way Ibrahim's son is also then kind of elevated, and these moments of trial become the moments of elevation, and that's what I remind myself of regularly. That's what I remind people who are going through difficulties in life, that the hardest moments are the ones that lead to the greatest spiritual elevation. Inshallah, if we kind of continue that to be Muslim, through those moments, to continue to maintain that fullness of faith and that state of the heart that is in full surrender.
Yeah, subhanallah. I mean, the analogy that you make with Prophet Ibrahim, as I've heard some scholars speak about his sacrifice was, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had to, if you could use the term, break him to the point where he had to break him down so that he could be completely emptied by fulfilling this command, or intending to fill this command, so that he could receive the immense spiritual gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could then give him. And in a way, this is very similar to what you've described with the mother of Musa in the story. I think any parent could relate of this, immense fear of not only losing your son, your baby son, but then on top of that, the command is actually requiring you to throw the son into the river, which is even more frightening. But in doing that, she sets the stage by fulfilling this divine command to begin this movement that will change the world, and it begins with her obedience to the divine command. And you mentioned her daughter. So the Qur'an, as you speak about in your book, it speaks about familial relationships. In your analysis, that the Qur'an, all the maternal and maternal daughter relationships are always portrayed in a positive sense, and you can see that even in this story with her daughter, the sister of Musa, in that she exemplifies the same watchfulness and care for Musa that her mother did. So if you could sort of take us further on the story with the story of his sister.
Yeah, so in the wider tradition, and this is one of the places where the Muslim tradition is clearly drawing upon its predecessors. Her name is Maryam, which is then the reason why we would have Mary, the mother of Isa, also be a Maryam, likely named after this Maryam in the Hebrew tradition. And we don't actually see much of her in the Qur'an after this particular moment of just obeying her mother's one-word command and really putting her own life in jeopardy by interacting with these palace guards. We have to just take ourselves back and remember that the palace guards would have been representing the people who are hostile to the Hebrews. So she's not only, doing this incredible feat as a small child, but there's also tremendous risk in it for her. So it's a real moment of courage. When I teach this story in circles of younger Muslim girls, I like to just ask with this story, where are the places in our lives where we've had to show courage, like this courage? So it's one of the ways I think that we can all learn from this particular story of familial loyalty and just this willingness to put one's own well-being at risk for someone else. The thing that I find fascinating about this particular girl child is that she's so witty, and in this moment knows exactly how to speak to get the child, get infant Musa alayhi salam, returned to her mother. And she's witty and she's crafty. And in a subtle way, I like to use it as an example of how Allah affirms subhanahu wa ta'ala the kind of insight of young girls, right? Like she's she's we don't know an age, and the ulama might speculate, but the Quran certainly doesn't narrate. But we can assume that she's young-ish, and I think it's so powerful to have a story in the Quran that affirms the capacity of a group that's maybe often overwritten or overlooked.
Yes, certainly. If we move on further, Musa becomes, a man, and then, we won't go through the whole story of Prophet Musa, but he ends up having to flee, and then ends up in the land of Madyan. And then we have this, very interesting narrative of his coming out of exile, and then and coming upon this group of people watering their herds, and coming across these two women who also are trying to water their herds as well. If you could pick up the story from there and give some reflections from that.
Yes, I adore this part of the Quran because we really do see this marriage proposal take place. We see the negotiations. We see the subtle ways in which, when there is presumably a romantic interest between the parties, how they maintain adab and decorum in this situation. So I've used this story, I think I call it Lessons from Madyan, and I offered these reflections. They're online on YouTube. And I think it's a great example for us of how a woman was actually here. The daughters at the daughters of, many people say Shaib, but we can just say the daughters of the Sheikh from Madyan. How she's proactive in suggesting, let's just say, to her father that Moses is strong and trustworthy, alayhi salam, and the ways in which her father picks up on the cues and then offers Musa alayhi salam this employment. And so I think that on the one hand, we see the words of Musa alayhi salam again in this moment where he's not sure where to go from here, sort of a parallel to the moment in his infancy. And then who comes to the rescue is these sisters who, as Allah's plan unfolds, are to become his family. And he spends a good deal of time in Madyan. And so he's again acculturated to this desert tribal nomadic peoples after having grown up in the palace, but also grown up at the breast of his mother. So he's very, we could say in our contemporary terms, like very multicultural. And the fact that he's grown up now in between so many worlds is, just brings this maybe insight and ability, perhaps. I'm reading in to kind of how the story here, but he's really had exposure at this point right before his prophetic calling to different cultures and peoples and ways of life. Like there's the Hebrew culture, there's the Pharaonic culture, now there's this like nomadic, desert dweller culture. So it's just a fascinating way. I know so many of us feel ourselves bicultural in various ways, or are able to speak different languages, literally or figuratively. And this is, when we think about leadership, the Qur'an in Musa alayhi salam is sort of giving us this figure of this multicultural leader. This is a very contemporary way to think about who he is, alayhi salam. But I think it's one of the ways that when I'm kind of doing this for the stories, for myself, but also for all of us growing up in a world where we're navigating, bicultural identities and trying to figure out how we lead and find our way in complicated societies.
one of the things you also mentioned about the story of, the two sisters with Musa, and then later on with, their father, is, as a whole, if you look at the characteristics of everyone involved in the story, the way Musa acts, the way the sisters act, the way the father acts, you sort of encapsulate it by describing that everybody in the story exercises modesty and dignity, the proper adab. And the message from that is, as we see what happens to all of them, is that they're shown God's favor.
Yeah, there's a certain patience, I think, that it occurs in so many of the Qur'anic stories, where we see that the sabr is what then enables the final blessing to come through. And even in this particular story, Musa alayhi salam is wondering and asking, literally describing himself as faqir and just in need of any blessing. And it's right in that moment after he says this beautiful prayer of desperation that this I don't know, say woman, or this young woman potentially, comes into his life. And I think about that particular moment because there's a way in which Allah's blessings are all around us all the time, but sometimes we ourselves need to be in that state where we're kind of so desperately begging in order to see the blessings that are kind of right there. And so, as we were talking about before, it's part of that cultivation of a certain state of being that we have to go through these immense trials in order then to be elevated by them. And I oftentimes think about this story about these women specifically being at this watering hole. And presumably the job of shepherding, if we think about ancient Near Eastern cultures, it really wasn't considered women's work. So they were probably, we could read into the details that the Qur'an is giving us, doing this work perhaps because they didn't have male family members to do it. And, they, as they say, their father is an old man. And this story in particular, it's one of these stories in the Qur'an. We could read it as, in this case of necessity, you find these two women stepping up for their family. And to go back to the point about sisters and this collaboration between sisters, the Qur'an is not clear kind of which sister does what and which sister the father kind of offers. And I always find that part of the story intriguing. And I think maybe the listeners have their own ways of reading into that particular aspect of the narration of our story. But it's also a story that, although the Hebrew Bible has the whole episode about going to Madyan, the story about the women at the watering hole, it's told so beautifully in the Qur'an, and the emphasis is really on the decorum between all of the parties involved. So it's just an inspiration for how, when we're in these situations, as we are in all parts of our lives, where we're interacting with people who are, to use the legal term, non-mahram, what is the etiquette, and then what is the etiquette around coming to know somebody's family, and then what is the etiquette around negotiating with that family around what are the logistics of the living situation post-marriage going to be like. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us advice in this story. You see both Musa alayhi salam and the father being incredibly obliging to each other and really going out of their way to emphasize the fact that they're not trying to put hardship on the other party. If only our families can do this. Ya Rab.
I mean, as you point out in your book, much of the Quranic narratives, they're about the prophets, but they're centered in many ways around the families of these prophets. So, the Quran is in many ways a story of family in many of these narratives, and you see the different variations and diversity in these narratives, and certainly in the story of Musa, we have another female figure who we need to reflect on, and that is, of course, his foster mother, or the wife of the Pharaoh. We sort of skipped that earlier on in the narrative, but if you could give us some of your insights from your analysis on the wife of Pharaoh and being a foster mother to Musa.
Oh, awesome. And before we go there, I did want to shout out this amazing new piece of scholarship by Karen Bauer and Feroz Hamza. It's called Women, Households, and the Hereafter in the Qur'an. And they really build upon what I do in my work, which is much more narrowly focused, to then expand and to look at this idea of households and how central they are to not only the Quranic storytelling, but also the Quranic ways of deriving law and thinking about family structures and responsibilities among different members of the family. So it is a very thick, very involved book, but it is tremendous and just adds so much to the discourse. So Women in Households in the Hereafter in the Qur'an, Karen Bauer and Feroz Hamza. But to the figure of the wife of Pharaoh, Asiya alayhi salam, this is a story that I think we really do need to have some of the background to appreciate the total circumstances of Asiya alayhi salam. In my work, I didn't say this at the beginning, but because the Qur'an is already so complex and involved and gives us so much, I didn't go into the tafsir in my work. I really limited it to the Qur'anic corpus itself because I was looking at intra-textual resonances and specific language choices, just within the Qur'anic corpus itself. But when it comes to the story of Asiya alayhi salam, the Qur'an already hints that she has to negotiate her relationship with her husband. And she does that again with tremendous acumen and knows precisely what to say to save this child that her family, the family of Pharaoh, pulls from the river. There is, I should also say, just in a comparative lens, from the Hebrew Bible text to the Qur'an, there is a slight difference in the way the story unfolds, but I think the differences that can actually be reconciled with a little bit of thinking. So the Qur'an talks about the family of Pharaoh pulling the baby from the river, and then in the Hebrew text, the daughter of Pharaoh is the one who pulls the baby from the river. Now, what we have to remember is Pharaoh is a title, and so it can very well be that the daughter of one Pharaoh is potentially the wife of another Pharaoh, or we can potentially also understand that the family of Pharaoh kind of includes the daughter and the wife. That would make sense linguistically. But in any case, there is that difference. And so Hebrew Bible scriptures talk about the daughter of Pharaoh being the adopted mother, whereas we talk about the wife. So I think the fact that Musa alayhi salam is raised by a foster mother, we've seen that the whole reason the Hebrew people are in this land of Egypt to begin with is because kind of Joseph and his kind of experiences being adopted by the palace. So if we just think about the narrative arc, the way that the Hebrew people get established in Egypt is through this adoption saga. And then the ways in which the Hebrew people then become liberated from the Egyptians is another kind of adoption saga. And on the one hand, Yusuf alayhi salam obviously has a problematic foster mother. And here, it's almost as if the Qur'an is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is balancing out this conception. So one can't walk away from the Qur'an thinking, horribly of foster mothers, because we have a good example and a poor example. So there's this parallel structure in the story, and there's so many other details that run parallel between Yusuf alayhi salam and Musa alayhi salam. And so, becoming established in the land and then fleeing the land of Egypt is really just artful storytelling. I mean, theological convictions aside, you just have to admit that is beautiful storytelling. So, what else can we say about Asya alayhi salam? Again, it's just an example of a woman who might not be strong in worldly terms because she's kind of subjected to the will of this tyrannical husband, ruler. But we see her inner strength. We see this insight. And I specifically use the word insight there because the Qur'an talks about the eye that is on Musa, this eye of protection, and he's the eye of his sister, and then his foster mother sees something in him, and so everybody's kind of picking up, whether because they're related to Musa or because they just see something special about this child. And we could say that that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's Allah's plan coming forward. Or we can say at the same time that that's something in the beautiful nature of the wife of Pharaoh, that she could see kind of truth for truth, and she had this inherent ability to kind of follow her heart and follow the impulse. And of course, in our story, that's kind of that leads her to Tawheed, coming out of this polytheistic Egyptian system.
What's so amazing about her, as some narrations, she's one of the the best women of all time, and yet she's married to the worst human being. And as you point out, the way the Quran describes her, and when we hear her very heartfelt dua, it gives a sense of, or it should instill a sense of compassion that we should have for people, especially women who are in these very difficult family situations. It's quite amazing that the Quran actually is giving us an eye, if you will, to look deeper into people's everybody has their difficulties, but to specifically look at this situation of a woman who's basically in the house with a tyrant.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good point too, just to call out the work of another amazing colleague of mine, Julianne Hammer, who is at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, has a book called Peaceful Families. It's out by Princeton University Press, and it's all about American Muslim efforts to combat domestic violence. And, it has in there insights that are extremely practical, as well as kind of sociological insights on why, here we have the Quran talking about, alluding to, let's say, a phenomena that we're still dealing with in the present. And it's just kind of where we started the conversation with this idea of a mother having to keep her child alive against genocidal forces. And that's the meta kind of structure of society that's oppressive. And then we have kind of in this same Musa early life saga, we see also that the home can be an oppressive place for some people.
As we conclude, I want to sort of pull back a bit. We were speaking about the wife of Pharaoh, and she makes this very well known dua in the Qur'an. And I thought it was interesting, by the way, how you point out how the Qur'an is bracketed by these two du'as, like the first in the sort of by the wife of Imran for a child, in the third chapter of the Qur'an, and then in Surah Tahrim, the sort of the final du'a of the wife of Pharaoh. So I wanted to speak a little bit about this point about women's speech in the Qur'an, which you make this observation, how much of the speech of women in the Qur'an is, I guess, is dua centric, if I could use that term.
Yeah, that's I think full on like a third mathematically, even as we start to kind of count it down. It's at least a third of women's speeches. And I also found that there was 33 verses of women's speech, which I also find, all we can say is that, subhanAllah, that's a number that holds some significance for us as Muslims because of the dua of Fatima, alayhi salam, having phrases repeated 33 times. So in any case, they're just interesting correspondences, let's say.
What does it say to you, as if you were able to sort of summarize some of this journey you've taken us on in this book, about what we're talking about, for example, the women's speech in the Qur'an, how it's often directed towards Allah, or it's connected to Allah's beautiful attributes, His blessings, His compassion. As we said in the beginning, how you speak about these female figures in the Qur'an and how they're active participants in these Quranic narratives to put on display or to articulate these transcendent spiritual lessons that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us in the Qur'an. If you could, to summarize some of that or some of your reflections in what this means to you, in terms of how we can engage the Qur'an, how we can engage the topic of male-female interactions, through the lens of the Qur'an.
Oh, there's so many gems in there that I could say. What I will just start off by saying, just zoom out and say that I spend a good deal of my days reading sacred wisdom literature from other traditions. I teach ancient history, and I teach a world religions course. So what initially, as I returned to the Qur'an, kind of having spent some time in other sources, I realized that there is not another scripture out there where we hear the voices of women in their own words in the scripture itself with such frequency and, I would say beauty. Of course, that's subjective, but frequency is, let's just go with that to be slightly impartial about it. But that's what initially, when I was thinking about female speech in the Qur'an, I was thinking about these stereotypes that are out there of, Western stereotypes of Muslims, women as kind of silenced. And then I was just delighted in the ways that the Qur'an gives voice to the female experience. And, not just by narrating things that are beautifully female-centric, but by actually giving women such powerful speech. And at the same time, we recognize that there's women in the Qur'an who use their speech towards nefarious ends, right? And so it's an acknowledgement, I think, in the Qur'an, of women's power and agency, and at the same time, a reminder to all of us, really, that, we use our agency to our liberation or to our peril. So, the female figures, they can speak to like women readers or women reciters in a particular way, but of course there are lessons for all of us.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. I mean, this is certainly, we can't touch about all the many points in your book, but this was very a beautiful journey through using the women around Musa as a case studies, if you will, to be able to touch on some of these themes and observations that you've made about the Quran in your book. So I want to thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, for taking time out of your schedule and giving us opportunity to discuss your book.
It's been such a pleasure. And of course, I inevitably say things that might not be true. I try as best as possible to be, accurate. And but may Allah forgive me for, anything that was not correct, and gently correct me, inshallah, so that we can just continue to teach this beautiful tradition and to be inspired by it, and really to help others be inspired by it as well.
To our listeners, thank you again for joining us on another program. Be sure to check out almadina.org for latest episodes and other programs. Inshallah, we hope to see you again on the next episode. Remember again to subscribe to the podcast, share it with friends or family, anyone who you think may benefit. And until then, assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you.